Ahoy! Dune Awakening just got an incredibly important announcement about the future of the game, both when it comes to PvE as well as PvP. There are going to be some significant changes specifically to the Deep Desert and things that are happening there. First of all, a significant portion of the Deep Desert will soon be PvE. They say they want PvE players to be able to play the endgame and have access to content of the endgame without forcing them to interact with a PvP system that they may have no interest in. This makes perfect sense, especially since a lot of PvE players seem to drop off the moment that you get to the Deep Desert. So the shift here is a very obvious one with the current player base. They say they still believe in the core concept of the Deep Desert, an endlessly renewing location that resets every week, which I think is great. But they also say they want the tension of heading out there, head on a swivel, eyes peeled for foes as you enter the most dangerous part of the most dangerous planet in the universe. This is interesting because if you're headed out into the Deep Desert right now without PvP, there wouldn't really be much tension. You could just pretty easily farm most resources relatively safely, with the exception of the sandworm. So I'm guessing that they're probably going to introduce some NPCs in the PvE areas as well, or other things that are threatening in some way. They said their wish was that players would embrace this loop, forming guilds to work together and overcome the bleakness of the Deep Desert. I think a big problem with that is that the early game is so PvE focused that throwing people into the deep end of the pool the moment they enter the Deep Desert is probably not exactly how most players would want to be introduced to PvP elements anyways, even if they may be interested, because you really have no PvP experience at that point. You suddenly need to learn all these things very quickly in order to survive and not get obliterated. So what will happen is that some areas of the Deep Desert will be flagged as partial warfare, PvE, where players are able to explore testing stations and harvest tier 6 resources without the threat of conflict they may not want. However, the top tier of the game is balanced around guilds and groups, so it will be more grindy if you do things solo, but I think that is completely fine. Landsraad control points, shipwrecks and the largest spice fields will still be PvP areas. The deepest parts of the Deep Desert will remain as they currently are, high risk, high reward. Now, those areas are probably going to be the ones that will also have the most dense concentration of the higher tier resources. We usually see these islands of Stravidium, of Titanium, and I'm thinking that is probably what's going to be in the PvP area still, and that's going to be where the guilds are really contesting them as well. Joel also says that the beauty of the Deep Desert design with weekly resets and renewals is that they can easily test things and experiment and see what layouts we like, and we're going to get some surveys about those too. So hopefully we'll see some more resource-dense maps in the future, some more layouts with more testing stations, more resources at the same time, especially if we have a PvE area now, because otherwise I think those flight times in between, where there's not really much going on, are going to become fairly long. If you enjoyed the video so far, consider subscribing and clicking the bell. Now, in terms of PvP, there are also some specific changes. They acknowledge that PvP itself has issues that need to be addressed, and of course, not all of them will be fixed immediately, but we're seeing the first steps here. The scout ornithopters with rockets attached will have their speed maneuverability reduced. Gonna have to see how much of a difference that really makes and how it feels. But also, rockets fired from scout ornithopters will have increased heat generation, and I think this is quite significant because you can already not shoot that many rockets with a scout ornithopter, and if you have more heat generation, that means that especially enemies that fly high up will be very hard to target for a scout ornithopter, as it should be. So I think this will shift the balance away from that a little bit. Question is, how many assaults are we going to see out there that will actually have rockets? Thrusters will provide a max speed bonus now regardless of your wings, so it's not limited by the wings, ensuring that thruster-equipped scouts will be the fastest vehicles in the game. I'll be honest though, unless you're just going for testing stations and shipwrecks, I feel like you almost always need storage on the Thopter, because otherwise you will just get a handful of resources and you have to fly for a really long time to do so, and it doesn't really seem worth it in my eyes. And I think with these changes you may also not need to rely on that. You just rely on the enemy overheating and not catching you. Also, a tier 5 infantry rocket launcher will be added, so you can fight vehicles a little bit better. I'm unsure how impactful this will really be. On one hand, I think it's great that we have that option because it's much easier to craft. Even if you're coming from PvE, you can prepare that way. The problem that I see with it potentially is while the handheld rocket launcher has a fair bit more damage on a rocket, the reload time is also incredibly long compared to, well, any other option for firing rockets. And unless you are standing on a Thopter and they don't know how to shake you off, which is actually really, really easy, you can just do a little barrel roll, you are likely not really going to be at too much risk, I believe. But I might also be wrong here. We'll see how strong this rocket launcher will really be, or if any other values will be adjusted alongside with that. Since at the moment I think the rocket launchers on vehicles are just outclassing the handheld one in terms of stats. They're also planning additional changes to mechanics like respawn timers, vehicle storage tools, hand scanners, and other mechanics. So what I'm particularly curious about here is the vehicle storage tool change, because that's a topic of much discussion, that basically if you get shot down with your Thopter and you store it quickly enough, you are usually fine and you're not really losing anything. We'll see in what direction they are taking that, especially if part of the desert will be PvE. Joel says that the intention for Deep Desert PvP is that unless you really mess up, you always have the option to retreat in good order with whatever you've managed to claim so far, and PvP should happen when both parties decide they want to fight over a location. Also, the intended mechanic has always been combined arms. They want Thopters to be important for crossing the desert, but they shouldn't be the dominant force in actual battles. So they're planning to make changes to accommodate ground battles and reinforce the use of player builds. This is really exciting to me personally because I believe that the ground combat is so much more interesting than the air combat in Dune Awakening, because you actually have your abilities and all the other mechanics. And there's polishing to be done there for sure, don't get me wrong. But I think that polishing can only be done if they actually get metrics for ground combat by people fighting on the ground rather than everyone just being in the air. As for the Landsraad system, they want this to both be for guilds, but also individuals and groups working towards their personal rewards, and everyone who participates should have things to do every day and every week. The current system is what he calls the earliest launchable iteration, so a very early state, and they want to expand upon that. The current tasks are very simplistic, a lot of hand-ins and crafting requests, and later on we should see more interesting things. Some examples given are more dungeons with bosses that drop endgame loot, more contracts that require specific tasks to be undertaken, more specialized delivery tasks that include components that cannot be stockpiles, and if they ever add raids, then those would have Landsraad tasks as well. It's meant as a general framework of continuous quests for endgame activities. They're also going to address some key flaws with the current design, for example the inability to hand in items after a square is completed, which means you also can't get personal score anymore, and the rapidity at which some squares are turned in. Also, stockpiling is currently rewarded, which is not their intention for the system, so they will make some changes to address that as best as they can. Joel also says Landsraad rewards are supposed to reflect the endgame tiers of progression. This includes the vendors, which can be unlocked for an entire faction through participation. This is the intention, but once again, let me acknowledge that this isn't exactly in the right place. The Landsraad will be updated to provide micro rewards for solo players or small groups. Overall, I believe this sounds very promising, even though I'm not entirely sure how some things will work out, especially the PvE area in the Deep Desert. It has a lot of other implications, like for example, people building further away, also meaning that people need to fly a bunch more to build up and tear down their bases, which some people may or may not like. So it's going to be interesting how that's going to be approached and what people think of it. And personally, I'm also wondering if they will find other avenues for PvP. I'm a huge fan of PvP, and I think this game lends itself well to PvP, but the PvP in the Deep Desert is very asymmetrical, obviously, because you have big guilds against single players or small groups, and usually it's not really fun for both sides. Personally, I prefer PvP to be more even grounds. Like, I don't mind a small disadvantage in terms of numbers, but something where you have roughly the same number of players fighting each other is, in my opinion, much more fun, and I'm hoping that if they take some of these PvP aspects away, which I'm completely fine with, they give us some other options for PvP. I've already mentioned the PvP arena is something that I would really like, and that's something that thematically fits into Dune, or other options to give us PvP on demand, maybe more so than having to fly into the Deep Desert and hoping for some of it. If you're interested in the layout of the Deep Desert for the next week, then definitely consider subscribing and clicking the bell, because I'm going to make a video where I scout out the desert and I tell you what I found. And after that, there will be an advanced flight guide. Thank you for watching, and thanks to my patrons for supporting this video. Duke Sloth, out.